We've had a chance to look at the sacrament of reconciliation in the patristic period. Now let's look at some major developments in the medieval period. And that starts with the rise of private penance, the move from everything being public to being much, much more private. So clearly a reform of ecclesial penance is only going to be possible if there's a retreat from the principle which forbade its repetition. That's going to be a primary change, is the allowing of repeated penitential practice. And as late as the Third Synod of Toledo, now you're talking Spain, but look at the date, 589, right? That's really the end of the patristic period. Repeated penance was rejected at that synod as, quote, an egregiously presumptuous practice. Now again, keep this date in mind because it'll come up in a couple slides. 589, a local synod in Spain tells us that repeated penance is an egregiously presumptuous practice. So what happens? The penance, the system of penance in the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon churches. So you'll often hear about the Irish monks. Well, what happens is a little bit, if you read the literature, it's a little bit of a, I don't want to say guesswork, but there's some, you have to form hypotheses over exactly why what happened. So there's a certain isolation of the Celtic church, right, from the rest of Europe. So because of its isolation, the Celtic church occupied a special place apart in questions of worship and discipline. I mean, they're on an island, right? And for centuries remained fixed in usages which differed from the rest of the church. In particular, it had no knowledge of the institution of public ecclesiastical penance which could not be repeated, and which involved canonical obligations. So it just didn't have this system of canonical penance that we saw from the rest of the patristic period. Penance here is private in character. Its reception consisted in confession, the acceptance of satisfaction fixed by a priest, and finally reconciliation. There were no juridical consequences, no order of the penitents, and it's available at all times to anyone. How did this arise? Again, this is some speculation, but it's thought that this form of penance originated in the monastic life of the Welsh and Irish churches. So monastic life had an influence here. Because in the monastic life, the abbot or abbess, was spiritual director of the entire community, both religious and lay in the larger community. And this frequent spiritual direction is at the root of the Celtic form of penance. So you would go to your spiritual director, who is the abbot or abbess, and they would hear your essentially confession and address it, right? And so the idea is this is what developed into private confession. The sources that we have on this for the Celtic penitential practice date from the 6th century. So we have information from the 500s. In essentials, these sources consist of what are called penitential books. You can see some of these in our library, by the way. We have not the originals. We have books though that contain these, the early penitential books, which provide, and here's what they do: they provide precisely determined penances for all offenses, whether grave or slight in character. So this is what became known as tariff penance. This is another term you'll hear sometimes. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but you can get a mental picture of it by look. It's like opening a book and on the left seeing a list of sins, and on the right seeing the list of assigned penances. This would be again, oversimplification, the general idea of penitential books and tariff penances. Sin X, penance Y. These are the sources we have for this this Celtic penitential practice. So these started from lifelong sentences of penance for certain crimes. We also find in those books penances of 15 years, 12, 10 years, 7 years, 1 year. For lighter offenses, penances of 40, 20, 7, even 1 day, right? As a complete side note, going slightly off script here, this is where if you look at older writings, older Catholic writings that talk about indulgences of a certain amount of days or years, it's connected more to this stuff, a kind of tariff penance. Since we don't really have a tariff penance, and we don't have a tariff penance in practice in the church anymore, all those ideas of this many days and years of indulgence, you'll see, is dropped out of our language. Now we talk about partial and I should know this off the top of my head, partial and plenary indulgences. Okay, so what else happens here? Although in ancient Celtic penance, there's a great emphasis laid on the penitential works, yet the ecclesial and sacramental aspects of penance still stand forth clearly. So yes, penitential works are important, but you get these other, it's not all on the person. There's these aspects of what the church does as well, right? It's only efficacious through the ministry of the priest. And as judge, he has to adapt the punishment to the gravity of the guilt and to the individual circumstances in light of the penitential books. In contrast to ancient church practice, here priests appear from the outset as the ordinary ministers of the sacrament of penance alongside the bishop, and only in exceptional cases is a particularly grave sin reserved to the bishop. The juridical function of the priest presupposes confession, right? In order to serve as judge over the penitential practice, the sinner has to make known the state of their soul. In this system, with its personal mode of procedure and its provision of special punishment for every individual offense, confession is naturally more strongly emphasized as compared with the old canonical penance. So you start to see a movement, the center of the sacrament being from penance to the confession. We're not completely there yet at this point. And now really a novelty appears that even slighter sins, what we call venial sins, in the greatest variety are submitted to confession. So you notice the shifts here, important shifts, from only serious sins to also lighter sins, from once in a lifetime to whenever needed, from the bishop as the ordinary minister to priests as the ordinary ministers. So you're really starting to see the formation of what we understand today as confession. Well, this practice of the Celtic Church is transplanted onto the continent, to the rest of the church. When? Well, the first ecclesiastical document to adopt the new procedure is Canon 8 of the Synod of, I think you would pronounce it Chalon, but I don't do French. It's a town in France. So another local council around the year 650. The sense of this document is that the faithful confess repeatedly to the priest. They're instructed by him and receive from him appropriate penances for individual sins. They're left to themselves to do the personal works of penance. Now, just notice this. I mentioned the date before of this Council of Toledo. This unanimous, now here in 650, this unanimously approved procedure is the exact opposite attitude of the Synod of Toledo only 60 years before. That's a huge shift from being an egregiously presumptuous practice in Spain. Down the road in France, 60 years later, it's adopted unanimously as the new practice. The best proof for the adoption of the tariff penance is provided by the Frankish penitential books. Again, more books now of the Frankish type, which were already numerous in the second half of the 8th century. So by the 700s, we have large documentation of this being widespread. Losing my place. Sorry about that. Yeah, so these books give the earliest information on the arrangement of private penance in the more universal church. Why did this happen? Well, the borrowings from the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon penitentials are primarily to be attributed to the practice of missionaries who continue to make use of their native form of penance. So those monks come over, those priests come over from the island, and they bring with them their penitential books. The penitential books must have been welcomed to the Frankish priests as a supplement to really their scanty canonical decisions that they had, right? They didn't have this tariff penance. So all of a sudden, the missionaries bring over this wealth of pastorally useful practice, and it's just adopted. Above all, however, these practices commended themselves by their greater mildness overall. Their mildness as compared with the very rigorous canonical decrees. So there's this move from the canonical penance to the tariff penance. So public penance, of which the voluntary reception was already in the 6th century a rare event, had practically disappeared by about the year 800. So by 800, the public nature of penance is essentially gone. Then again, there's this rise of confession as a confession, which had been more of a preliminary to penance, now takes on the center stage in the sacrament in a sense, slowly. In principle, the ancient Christian requirement that ecclesiastical penance should be undertaken for the forgiveness of mortal sins, it remains in force. The only difference being that now it was to be done not only once in a lifetime, but as often as anyone had committed a serious offense. In practice, by the way, grave sins before the reception of communion was required by all as a matter of course. Soon, though, pastoral considerations led to confession being made obligatory on all at fixed times. And that's where the Fourth Lateran Council comes in 1215, makes annual confession the general law of the Church, which it still is today. Confessing our sins annually is one of the precepts of the Church. That arises at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. What else happens? Well, as the humiliation, or maybe that's the wrong word, the humility that comes with it, but, the humiliation of public penance, once that ceases, it's confession that starts to be seen as the concrete expression of the sinner's penance in the sight of the Church. So if I'm no longer doing public penance, what's that outward expression of my sorrow? Well, it's the confession itself, even if private. In spite of all the emphasis which was laid on it, confession, though, was by no means considered yet as the most important factor in the performance of penance. As in the past, even at this time, satisfaction, the penance, was still the real efficient cause of the forgiveness of sins. Confession still was primarily a means, the purpose of which was to enable the priest to determine the penance appropriate to the quantity of sins. However, in the face of the gradual decline in the severity of penance, confession itself starts to be considered as a penitential work, and its expiatory value is stressed, that it's the confession itself that is assisting in the effecting of the forgiveness of sin. This is found in the humility and the self-conquest that confession involves, again, even if private. The imposition of penance took place at the confession, and was followed by the penitential blessing along with prayers, the same as or similar to those used in public penance. So now get this, where we are right now, I want to highlight this. The private penitential practice has been imported, you can say, to the continent. This is the tariff penance, frequent confession, privately, but this is talking about how it was undertaken. You confess your sins privately. There's a giving of penance at that time, but there's no absolution at that point. There's no reconciliation at that point. What's given are blessings and prayers that were the same as those in the earlier form of public penance. Get this, even at this point, reconciliation was an independent act, and for the time being still separated from confession as it had been in the past. So you'd confess, and you'd be assigned your penance, and you'd be blessed and go on your way, and then you'd have to come back. And the difficulty of summoning people a second time, the danger involved that many would even forego reconciliation, naturally led to confession and reconciliation being brought together as one whole. And here's maybe our final move in this development of the sacrament. So from about the year 1000 onwards, a nice round number to remember, the contraction or the bringing together of the penitential procedure into one act can be said to be the general practice, so much like we have it today. With the bringing together of confession and reconciliation completed by the 11th century, the external procedure of penance had in its essentials attained the form in which it's practiced to this day. It consisted of confession, the imposition of penance, absolution, and its characteristics are that it can be repeated at will and that it's binding on all. Now in our next video, we'll look at some of the highlights of the theology of penance in the scholastic period.